Happy to be here. The I actually, Jerry said, "Oh, I think it would be good to give a talk on managing managers and beyond." So that's kind of how this title came about. So I hope that it lives up to that. Okay, so a little bit about me. I've been at Airbnb for a few years, for 5.5 years, and we moved into a business unit structure a year and a half ago. So I lead engineering for our homes business, and I spent many years working on search at Google before that. I thought since this is about the experience of kind of scaling teams, that I would give a little bit of context around just my transition. And so in 2015, I started managing managers. I was leading search, and the team was growing. And this is all at Airbnb. And then in 2016, I started managing the umbrella team that Search was part of around all of our marketplace conversion efforts. And then we formed the homes business. We consolidated a bunch of teams. And that was about 250 engineers. And then this year, we sort of, just have a lot of things we want to get done and working on sort of scaling the team from there. Okay, so setting the stage, right? I'm sure many people here have been in a situation like this. You often, find yourself that you don't have the bandwidth to manage individual contributors directly. You're becoming a bottleneck in decision making, which, is you never want to be a bottleneck. You never want to be known as sort of the blocker for something, moving along. And, to make all of this worse is that you need to add even more people. And so, a lot of this talk is about managers and scaling, but and I'm just going to run through this quickly. But you can imagine that each spoke of a wheel is a person on the team or some way that the team has to operate. And your goal as a manager is really to make all of that kind of work together and move really fast, right? I mean, that is a successful team when everything is working together. You sort of have everyone that just, is able to do a lot more and they're happier as a result, right? Any engineer is they're going to be the happiest when they actually ship and deliver work. And that means that you need a lot of enabling pieces to work well before that. So in this talk, I'm gonna go into three aspects, right? So the first one is identifying engineering managers, and then how do you scale teams and decision making, and then finally, how do you what are the operational processes? A lot of managers, focus a lot on the day-to-day sort of how do we make this decision and that decision? But as you scale, you find that there's a lot of these operational processes that keep all of this going. Okay, so let's jump into the first topic. So when you're identifying managers, right, you often find that everybody's gravitating to this one person, right? You have this person that is already making technical decisions, and you want to identify those sort of spots on the team, because ultimately you want that transition to feel very natural, right? You don't want people to be surprised. So I would say that's sort of the first thing to look out for. And then the other one is, they genuinely care for their teammates. And a trick that you can actually use is, look at performance reviews and see who writes really detailed peer reviews, right? You'll see that there are some people that, provide feedback, positive and negative, but in a very constructive way. And there are people that, that just think about things in that way. And you can always train people for sure. But, if you're trying to figure out, is this person ready? That's just a trick that has worked. But, these people actually genuinely do care about bringing the team up. And then, the final thing is, you do want to find people that want to be collaborative, that want to build bridges, right? Because most teams, you actually sort of need to work with a lot of other people to get things done, right? There are very few teams where you're just completely insularly sort of focused. And so, if there's a manager that can sort of collaborate really well with other teams, you'll just find that their team can get a lot more done. And so I've just found that to be, a very valuable sort of a valuable quality. And I think in summary, right, the person is already doing the job before you transition them to the role. And a lot of people say, oh, is it a promotion? Is it a transition? I feel pretty strongly that it is a transition, and it's just a different sort of set of responsibilities that they take on. Okay, so you have you've identified a manager, but how do you actually scale your team? So the first, I think the most important aspect to think about is how do you scale your org structure? And, imagine a scenario where you have 10 to 15 engineers that you're managing, and you know the team needs to grow more. So in that scenario, you have to figure out how that's going to scale. And there are usually, two options, right? You either split the team into two or you add another layer. But in either scenario, you have to figure out how to sort of go from one team to two teams. And I can share an example. And I've spoken to other people about the how do you split a team, and there's no sort of one perfect way of doing it. There are some people that do it based on specialties. People want a central machine learning team or a central mobile team, or depending on the life cycle of the project, sort of that might make sense. Some people do it on user journey. So I'll give an example from the search team of how we sort of split it. So first we had, search experience and ranking, and then we had search infrastructure. So we just had two teams. And then what we said is that, hey, the search experience ranking team is getting pretty large. So we split that into two, a dedicated ranking team and a product team. And then what we found was the product team was getting very large. And so we decided to split that in based on the user journey. So we said, let's have the search page be one team, and then the listing page be another team. And now we have a lot more teams, under the search umbrella. But that was just a way that we thought of dividing up the teams. Okay, so now you know your org structure. Then is your second key question, which is, do you hire externally or do you find someone internally? And so a philosophy that I've used is that I only want to go externally if I'm looking to up-level the team in some way that I don't have the skills internally. And then usually when I go through the interview process, I take the strongest candidate that I have internally, and I always try to make sure that the person that I'm bringing in is actually significantly stronger than that person, because otherwise, I should bet internally in that sort of in that scenario. So that's kind of worked. And again, sometimes you have this urgency to fill a role, so you might not have the luxury of waiting. Sometimes you're thinking of the growth you're going to have in 2 years, and you want to bring a specific type of leader. So all of those are additional factors to consider. This one, you sort of do this at every stage, but especially as you scale, you will only be able to do it successfully if your senior engineers, especially individual contributors, feel empowered and take ownership to solving really large problems, right? Like a lot of people kind of, you try to have individual teams that are given narrower scopes, and then you find that, senior engineers on those teams don't have visibility into sort of the problems that the entire org is facing. And so I do think as a leader, it is your responsibility then to make it clear what those big problems are and make sure that your senior engineers really do feel empowered. Because if you don't have your senior engineers, then it's hard to keep everything else going. And then the final thing to scaling is actually what I think of as building a lot of trust. And I think the way to build trust is to actually always be transparent in your decision making and to always be able to explain your perspective and decision. And this works in many ways, right? So let's say that you want to convince someone to make a certain change or take on a certain project. I think it's always valuable to explain why you think that person is a good fit for the role. Like how are you going through that process? And you'll often find that the other person, reflects on it and they're like, yeah, I think that this opportunity is right for me. So it's like, you want to leave the decision to the other person, but you also want to build enough trust that they know that, you actually do care about their career path. And then just in general, in terms of, big decisions, I think people do want to know, why you've made a certain decision. So always aim for more transparency. Okay, and now let's jump into the final section, which is the operational processes. The first point I wanted to talk about is just keeping a pulse on the team. And this gets harder as your team grows. And the key point here is that one-on-ones don't scale, right? And also people stop telling you things, right? Or you'll find out when things are very are big problems, but you won't be able to hear all from all aspects of your org. And so you have to figure out ways of doing this. I mean, something that I do is I do these skip level lunches every week, and so I get to meet with a set of engineers from a team just to hear from them. And again, my main goal with doing that was that they can put a face to a name. It's not just, oh, you see somebody and it's like, oh, I don't know if I can send that person an email, just to try to make it a little bit easier. One thing I did early on in a team I managed was that I spoke to a couple of people and I told them that, hey, I really want you to come and tell me, if you're seeing problems, you don't have to tell me who is bothered by this or who has this complaint. Just because if I don't know the problem, there's no way I can tackle it. Okay, the second one is to build an operating rhythm. And what this means is, how do people in the org know sort of predictably when things are going to happen, right? When do you meet with your directs? When do you meet with the recruiting team? If you work very closely with an infrastructure team, when do you meet with them? When do you do all hands? When do you send out weekly communication? Do you send out monthly communication? So just being very deliberate about how all of that happens is, I think it just helps with again, people just knowing, when to expect things from their leader. And then, the final aspect is always find times to drive efficiency. If you think of the product development process, engineers have to build whatever goes into production. And so that means that engineering is the scarcest resource. So anything that you can do to increase efficiency is going to just make people happier and you're going to get more done. And so something that, last year we had this problem where we found that our engineers, especially senior engineers, were spending a lot of time coordinating between different teams. And we had some pretty large sort of migrations and projects that we were doing, and it was just very hard to sort of have a bird's eye view. So we started building out a TPM org. And I know that many of your companies probably have this set up, but I think it was one of those things that we just said, hey, we really need this. We're going to prioritize this. We're going to bring in a TPM, a technical program manager, to come in and grow out an org for what is needed. So this is one example of driving efficiency. The main key is that anything you can do to sort of take away work from your engineers is valuable. Okay, so some final thoughts, closing thoughts, is that there isn't a playbook. I think it's key to build a network of people, within your company, outside, that you can bounce ideas off. There's always new situations that come up, and you'll also find that you might encounter the same problem in two different companies, but there are just differences in the specific people involved or the way the company operates that it's just always valuable to hear more perspectives. And that's why this conference is also, a good venue to do that. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we actually have about 5 minutes for questions. So I'm going to start taking them from our list. Should you let go the technical aspect when you're no longer the first line manager, where you were probably hands-on or a technical expert?
Yeah, this is, okay, it's a good question. So I'll start with a story, which is, I once had an engineering manager that had about 12 direct reports. And every time I walked by his screen, he always had his window open and he was writing code. And, it was just this sign of, sort of, what are the problems that you're getting very excited about, right? Are you sort of on a day-to-day basis very excited about writing code? Because maybe that is actually the right career path for you. I do think that managers sort of should be very, very technical. But when you take on people management, there are a lot of additional responsibilities that you are taking on. And a lot of times, if there's a big technical sort of problem that comes up, and you as a manager are jumping on it, you are taking that opportunity away from another senior engineer on your team. So, I think that as a manager, you can provide a lot of leverage by identifying those problems no one else is thinking of on your team, but also giving away those problems so others can grow.
Great. Next question is, what are key things to cover in a one-on-one with a manager who works with you?
Yeah, okay. So I think that a lot of people will say that their one-on-ones become very tactical, right? Where you start talking about your project or you talk about some problem at hand. And so, I think there's a balance of the type of conversations that you want to have. Career conversations, I think, is one of those very important sort of topics, and so and that often can fall to the background because there are other burning things that come up. So one thing I found that you can do is you can set up monthly career conversations. So one of your one-on-ones, you just explicitly rebrand it as a career conversation. So it just makes it a lot easier. It's not, or like I've heard from engineers sometimes they're like, oh, my manager doesn't bring this up, I don't know how to do it. If you just call the meeting a career conversation, like it is clear what the goal is, right? So you don't have to bring it up in a conversation. Yeah.
Great. So how do you transition an individual contributor on your team into a first-line manager?
I think there's a lot of different ways. Actually, there are companies I've heard that have a whole 6-month official transition program. I think companies have different sort of support systems for that. At Airbnb, it is something that you kind of work out with your manager. And I have seen many cases where there is this sort of informal transition period where managers identify that I think that these are the areas that I want you to take on to demonstrate these skills, and then that's how sort of people transition. But yeah, somebody was telling me that there is a company where there's this official 6-month transition, and at the end of it, they can easily transition back to an IC. So different models work here.
All right, so we have time for one more question. This one is from Leandro. What do you think is a good size of direct reports a manager should have before deciding to split it?
I think managing more than 10 people is hard. I mean, I've managed at some point a lot more than that, and I've actively worked on sort of, making it sort of more manageable sized. I mean, at Airbnb, we do go for a rough ballpark of 1:10. I think the trick is knowing how fast your company is scaling and being ready for that scale. Because oftentimes in a high growth environment, what you'll see is that you're aiming to have 10, but then the team ended up growing, doubling in size in 6 months, and you just didn't have people that could take on sort of management for it. So I think aspirationally, like we try for a 1:10 ratio.
Great, thank you very much, everybody. Round of applause.